For more on Pyongyang's latest missile test and how the international community is responding, let's talk to Zhang. He's the Chief Correspondent with Shanghai Wen Hui Daily here in Washington, D.C. Also with us, Becker. He's the National Coordinator with the Answer Coalition and an analyst on U.S. DPRK relations. Thanks to both of you for being with us. So let me start with you. Let's talk about the DPRK and its missile and nuclear program. One of the responses we hear very often from U.S. officials, and we just heard it there from Ambassador Richardson, is that China needs to do more. And as I pointed out, China has already done quite a bit. It's imposed sanctions. It's put a proposal on the table that's been rejected by the United States. What else can China do?
I think when Ambassador Richardson was saying that China needs to do more, he was talking about those kind of actions China can do outside of the UN security sanctions. So he was talking about like to reduce the oil supply to North Korea, to close those kind of DPRK's companies inside China. He was talking about to reduce regular trade relations between DPRK and China. But that is going to be difficult. China has been fulfilled its obligations to the UN security resolutions, but China is a little bit hesitated to do those kind of things, which is linked to humanitarian kind of purpose things.
Brian, Ambassador Richardson talked several times there of diplomacy as a way out of this crisis. But can diplomacy succeed when the United States deploys its military hardware in the region and talks about all options being on the table?
Well, ultimately, Washington has to make a decision. It's not Beijing that has to make a decision. I'm glad that Ambassador Richardson doesn't want preemptive strikes. I'm glad he doesn't want a war. But I think he's actually wrong. The problem isn't in Beijing, and probably the problem isn't in Seoul. The question really is for Washington policymakers. Do they want to end the Korean War? Because ultimately, that's what the DPRK wants. The DPRK wants normal relations with its southern neighbor. It wants normal relations with the United States. That would require the United States to agree to stop threatening DPRK every year, as it does with the simulated destruction of a country that the United States, in fact, did destroy in 1950 and 51. So these war games are not games. They're not funny. They're not anything that the North Koreans can take as anything but a perceived threat. And so North Korea is going to keep building missiles. They're going to keep testing missiles. They're going to keep advancing their technology until they feel secure. And the only way to make DPRK feel secure is for Washington to say, you know what, the Korean War, like World War II, like the Vietnam War, like all wars in history, must have an end. And the way to end it is with a peace treaty. And I think also Ambassador Richardson is wrong about one other thing. North Korea just doesn't want food. The people are not starving. I was there in 2013. I've been there over the past 25, 30 years, in fact. That's maybe true in the 1990s. It's not true now. There's a lot of robust economic activity. They're not on their knees. What DPRK is willing to exchange, perhaps a cap on its nuclear weapons system or testing, is for an actual normalization of relations, not for food.
So there appears to be a belief here in Washington among officials, we heard it there again from Ambassador Richardson, that Beijing has a great deal of leverage over what happens in the DPRK. What kind of leverage does Beijing have?
As I was talking about, Beijing is one of the major trade partners with DPRK. We have about 85 to 90% of the total trade with DPRK, and also about 90% of the total energy supply to DPRK. And DPRK is having some other, like, people-to-people financial cooperations with Chinese side. But I think, too, as Mr. Becker was talking about, to put all the responsibilities of this issue to China is not fair. And I think the bottom line is that North Korea has been demanding a final solution to these peninsular decades of issue, and they want to have a final solution with America and South Korea, not with mainly China.
Brian, as far as diplomacy goes, we have the six-party talks. That has stalled right now. Is it time, do you think, for a bold move for the United States to hold direct talks with Kim Jong-un? President Trump said he's willing to do that. The new leader of South Korea says he's willing to do that.
The conditions have been set with the election of Moon Jae-in in South Korea, as they were with the election of Kim Dae-jung in the late 1990s, for not only the relaxation of inter-Korean tension, in other words, a thaw, but for the Trump administration to do as Bill Clinton started to do in 2000, which was to reach back in the context of this thaw between North and South. In other words, the sunshine policy that Moon Jae-in seems to be embracing now. President Trump could do this. He's beset by domestic squabbles and crisis. He's under attack from his critics. Sometimes presidents go to war to divert attention from their domestic political crisis. But perhaps Donald Trump could go to peace. In other words, have peace break out in the Korean Peninsula and take responsibility for it. Certainly, there are some parts of the U.S.-Washington establishment who know that this is a dead-end game. North Korea's technology is advancing. It won't be stopped unless there is some sort of negotiated settlement. I think it could be bilateral talks rather than the six-party talks. Six-party is better than nothing. But really what the North Koreans want and what Trump could do is a bilateral agreement with the DPRK in which they cap their nuclear missile tests in exchange for the beginning of a process towards a peace treaty.
Zhang, we don't often hear from the DPRK, but we did hear from one of its diplomats, Ju Yong-choi. He recently defended his country's actions. He was speaking at the UN in Geneva. Let's watch and see what he said.
All the military steps taken by the DPRK in its territorial land and air waters are the exercise of legitimate right to self-defense to counter such persistent and braggandish nuclear threats and blackmail of the US and its followers. And it is an exercise of a legitimate right to self-defense in accordance with the United Nations Charter and international law. It is a wanton violation of the sovereignty and dignity of the DPRK to term these self-defense measures provocation and threat to peace.
So given what we heard there, the DPRK saying that it is vulnerable to attack, how does China view what Pyongyang's doing?
I think back in 1991, DPRK and South Korea were having a deal for the issue of nuclear weapons in the peninsula, and they finally decided to the non-nuclearization of the peninsula. And after that, North Korea, I think South Korea has decided not to develop nuclear weapons. And also US has withdrawn from the peninsula its nuclear weapons. So that's an advantage for the DPRK. And the denuclearization of the peninsula has been a consensus of international community. And China has been supportive to that principle. And I think nuclear weapons are not self-defense weapons, and it will not help North Korea, DPRK, to have long peace. The only way for the peace in peninsula from Chinese perspective is a kind of compromise, is a kind of resolution by DPRK, by South Korea, by America, and supported by China.
Right, Brian, doesn't this call into question the whole idea of nuclear weapons as a deterrent? You know, the DPRK has expressed its fears about being attacked by the United States. We look at what the United States has done in the past few years. It invaded Iraq on a belief that Iraq had WMD, wrongly as it turned out. It persuaded Muammar Gaddafi in Libya to get rid of his nuclear program, and we know where Muammar Gaddafi is right now.
When you listen to the DPRK, those are the examples they use. They point to Iraq. Iraq disarmed under UN supervision. It was disarming up until March 19, 2003, when the United States started bombing it. Same with Gaddafi. And both countries were invaded. In both cases, the head of state was killed. In the case of Iraq, he was put on trial and then hung. In the case of Gaddafi, lynched in the streets, to which Hillary Clinton said laughingly, "We came, we saw, he died," as if it was a good thing that a head of state was lynched in the street. DPRK withdrew from the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, after it was branded as part of the axis of evil by George W. Bush in 2002, Iraq, North Korea, and Iran, and clearly the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq. North Korea said, okay, we're going to withdraw from the NPT, which is their legal right under the premise of self-defense, and we're going to get nuclear weapons because that will be our only defense, because they could use the example of what was happening to other small countries. Is that irrational? I don't think so. I think it's very rational if you can put yourself in the shoes of the DPRK.
Song, the deployment of THAAD, we heard Ambassador Richardson saying that he agrees with that. It's a good thing. He supports the idea of deploying the THAAD anti-missile system in South Korea. But how does it change the balance of power in the region? China is strongly opposed to the deployment of THAAD.
Mm-hmm. THAAD is a kind of high-altitude defensive system. I think it helps United States and Japan more than South Korea. And I think THAAD will not be capable to defend South Korea in the coming future, because North Korea, the DPRK, fundamentally, they have a lot of artilleries which can reach Seoul within a couple of minutes, which cannot be deterred or be defended by the THAAD system. I think to some extent, the THAAD will help South Korea to detect any kind of nuclear tests or ICBM tests in the future, but it will not guarantee security of South Korea, and they need to find a way out, not this deployment of THAAD.
Okay, thanks to both of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.